I'm very reluctant to tell Professor Kibwana to sit down because he is always extremely interesting and worth listening to. Professor Kibwana, your work in Makueni.
And that is why in the sequel administration, the administration of Uhuru Kenyatta, some of the laws that were passed were inherited from work that had been done. Therefore, to conclude, so that I don't get into trouble with my senior, maybe when we continue to look at our constitution, perhaps maybe after 2027, we may want to go back to what about the parliamentary system? What about proportional representation? What about strengthening devolution so that we don't have like 47 entities that pay more of the salaries than having provision for development. And strictly speaking, because of all this, that work was done under his leadership, stewardship, we have no deficit of laws. It is a deficit of culture and practice of implementation, so that we have a progressive constitution, and here and in many places in Africa, there is still the one-party ethos guiding the implementation of whatever happens, even when they are progressive constitution.
I'm very reluctant to tell Kibwana to sit down because he is always extremely interesting and worth listening to. Professor Kibwana, your work in Makueni County is now subject of study, and I know some foreigners and local Kenyan young scholars who want to know what sort of development went into Makueni and how you did it yourself. I would like to ask Professor Peter Kagwanja to come and tell us something about the Look East foreign policy under the Kibaki administration. Professor Kagwanja, actually he's the youngest of all these scholars you see here, but that's why he's the most active. And he was a graduate student when I knew him at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the US, before coming to work in South Africa, then eventually to come to work for the government here, including the party, the Democratic Party. So Professor Kagwanja, and please don't exceed.
I'll keep time.
You're a diplomat, I know you. Please.
Excellency, Mheshimiwa Kalonzo Musyoka, our former Vice President, our former Deputy President, Mheshimiwa Gachagua, my friend, former Minister, my in-law, I must say that, my brother-in-law, Eugene Wamalwa, our patron, former Minister Munyao, our chairman, our distinguished friend and mentor in many ways, Mheshimiwa Francis Muturi, and others. I think I was to start with a statement that kind of prefaces the whole of this meeting, which is that Kenya is a resilient nation. We are a resilient people. We shall surely rise like that proverbial phoenix from the ashes and rise again. Because one of us, as President Mwai Kibaki did, will rise up, be a man of integrity, be a man of Solomonic wisdom, be a man of untold patience, and guide us through the thick and bring us to the right. That man will always rise in this country. For centuries to come, Kenya will go through difficulties, but somehow God will always bring another Kibaki to look after us today, so that we should not give up, we should not get angry. It is going to be the cycles of our lives. I was not associated with President Mwai Kibaki as one of his cabinet ministers, as Professor Chega said. I didn't get there. What I did is that when he visited South Africa in 2004, his first state visit, I was one of the team that welcomed him, with Ambassador Tabitha Say. And we had a moment of talking. And somehow, when he came back, I was appointed the head of the team that drafted Kenya's first ever foreign policy document, which now become our foreign policy accepted in 2014 cabinet, and which was revised this year. I also headed his team that established Kenya's foreign policy institute and academy, whose aim was to ensure that Kenya's understand that foreign policy is family rooted in our national interests. Third, in 2007, I was asked to join the strategy team for the election campaign. Very challenging time for us. I headed his technical team in the negotiation for the 2010 internal negotiations with the opposition that time, which was already in the government. And he appointed me as his executive director to head the referendum, both as a strategist and also as a manager of the campaign. And we did well, and he was happy with that. We got 70%, and we got a new constitution. And finally, I was asked to help advise on the transition from 2010 to 2013. A very difficult task for anybody, extremely difficult, because democracies have difficulties transiting or having peaceful transitions. But somehow he managed to have one of the most peaceful transitions from himself as President Uhuru Kenyatta. And the country has continued from that stability. So I was privileged as a scholar to be in the back rooms and to give my intellectual feedbacks. I think when I first met he told me, Professor, we know what we are doing. We meet every day that we need to have a lean, non-interventionist state. For Kibaki, the state is important in steering development and also pulling people out of poverty. So the state is important. And he, in that light, was identifying with the young tigers in Eastern Asia, which had already managed to pull themselves from poverty and to bring about development. And that was the main linchpin of his foreign policy, that our foreign policy is developmental, and everywhere it goes, it has to be developmental. Second, Kibaki created a foreign policy that was driven by knowledge. Not only knowledge of ourselves, which was based in Vision 2030, but knowledge of other nations and what they mean to us. Not what they mean to themselves and to others, but what they mean to us. And I'm going to explain that further. And therefore, in this foreign policy, which is based on knowledge, we need men and women of knowledge. We need to put our best and ablest in public offices, in foreign missions, as envoys, and that is the only way we can succeed. He believed strongly in the idea of meritocracy in our diplomacy. Without meritocracy, without having our best out there, those with the technical knowledge, those with scientific knowledge, we cannot go far. Third, President Kibaki based our foreign policy on our national interest, not on what he believed in, not on what those in his government believed in, but what we knew as our foreign policy. I know he asked the National Security Council to define clearly what our national interests are. I teach at the National Defense University, and anytime, because that's the course I teach, I always go through them without change, because they are cast in concrete. Top of those is our development, our national economic development. The fourth and the final pillar is a foreign policy propelled by 1, Kenyan nationalism, 2, Pan-Africanism, and 3, principles of humanism internationally, that all human beings are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights and powers as well. And therefore, the foreign policy is subordinated to the interest of our people. It cannot serve individual interest. And what did he do about the orientation of this foreign policy? I know Professor Chege has talked about Kibaki Rook East policy. No, Kibaki's policy was not neither Rook East nor Rook West. It had 4 aspects to it. 1, it was African-centered. Kenya is an African state. We are guided Pan-Africanism as our ideology, and our interests of Africa come first before any other interest. And therefore, we are Afrocentric in our orientation. Second, we Rook West. We re-Rook West. Listen, re-Rook West. He said we cannot abandon traditional relationship with the West. But what we need to do is to subordinate those relationships with the West to our national interest. And therefore, in addition to our embassy in London, he decided that we are going to open a new embassy in Dublin. And people are asking, why do we have to have 2 embassies? Because Dublin was the European capital of IT. This is where the technology was at that time really flourishing. Without that move, I'm not sure we would have made M-Pesa. Because Kibaki knew that we need to deepen ourselves in Dublin and the European technological movement so that we become a technological nation. And that's why Kenya is the leading African nation in technology. There's no other move. He also decided that we are going to Madrid, Spain, whereas Madrid was never, Spain was never a colonizer in Africa. Why? Because Spain is a source of our technology, it's also a source of tourists who want to come to Africa, and many other aspects that were coming in. So that is what we are calling re-looking the West, not abandoning the West, but looking deeper into the West from the prism of our national interest. Third, we look East. And by East, he did not define it as China. He said we look at the whole East, including Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. But more primarily to China. Why? Because these are emerging economic powerhouses. And they had deep resources that we could tap to finance our development, particularly our infrastructure. I was part of the delegation of the government to New York, I think around 2006, when we wanted to refurbish our railway, to build a new railway. And that proposal was put before the World Bank by President Kibaki's team. It was rejected, and they said, refurbish the old railway, privatize it, and then all will be given unto you. After doing that, the railway essentially grounded to a halt, and 95% of our cargo had to move by road, and the consequences are familiar to us. So President Kibaki went to China with a very singular issue. We need to open our infrastructure, our roads, our railways, our ports, and all the arteries of our economy. That was what Look East policy was like. But Kibaki did not just look east. Finally, he looked south. And looking south here meant that we went to Brazil, and there we got our airlines, the Embla and others. So we looked elsewhere. So those are the 4 orientations of Kibaki's legacy. And in conclusion, let me say this. In line with President Kibaki's legacy, in decades and centuries to come, Kenya will have its raw moments. But one of us will rise and will lift us from that rawness and bring us to greatness, bring us to prosperity, bring us to self-pride as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kagwanja. You kept within time. Honorable Nyaga, my kid brother, welcome. I would like to welcome a distinguished gentleman, President Kibaki's Minister for Trade and Industry, a distinguished career which began as my student, I must say, one of the most distinguished students I've ever taught. I think he taught me what I taught him. And in politics, and very dedicated man to the welfare of our country. And professionally, so competent, the world had to listen to him as Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, first Kenyan, to my knowledge, to head a specialized agency of the United Nations and do it so competently as well.
The family of the late President Mwai Kibaki, Your Excellencies, party leaders, you have all been recognized. The only ones who have not been recognized individually are our flavor of the month, Justin Muturi. My whip when I was a minister under Kibaki, Norman Nyaga. Ladies and gentlemen, for purposes of turning this into a conversation involving all of you, I will keep within the time limit, but also say things that others have not said. Quite a bit of what I wanted to say has been said, particularly by Professor Kagwanja, aligning national, international, and domestic policy with identified national priorities. But if you may allow me, I want to reminisce, not in a way of remembering what Kibaki did, but in raising our collective challenge of the moment in the light of how Kibaki dealt with it. And for this, I think I start with a sound reading of the situation. I start with the earliest time I had intense interaction with the late president was around the year 2000, when we were trying to build a coalition of the opposition. And what he was exuding of as a leader was being so comfortable in your own standing that you don't try too hard to impose yourself as the leader. That through the period when we were bonding, it was very difficult. There were real spoilers, and normally you were present. You could hear Mwai Kibaki, Martin Shikuku go off about you Kikuyus and what you have done to us. And Matu Amai reply with how much we have the money and we have the people, we'll just remember and sympathize with you. But Kibaki had to rein in all these extremes and accommodate without overemphasizing his role as the leader. But to me, this also indicated an underlying strength that Kibaki had, and it ran through his leadership. He was clever enough to know that he was not adequate in everything. I never know clever people who think they know everything. When you find such people, they're not clever. Yeah. And being adequately clever meant that he tried to identify talent that he could nurture, but he could also assign responsibilities to persons that he thought could perform. But to me, the most important evidence of his sense of clever enough to feel inadequate was the importance he placed on the creation of a National Economic and Social Council. I think one of the most important features that really set up the beacons for the Kibaki presidency was to say, if you are sailing without a rudder, you can end up where you came from instead of the right destination. And you cannot overstate the importance of the National Economic and Social Council and one of its products, Vision 2030, in aligning immediate political priorities with long-term identified national agenda that is depersonalized, that is not a Kibaki agenda, but an agenda for Kenya. Secondly, the humility of Kibaki surprised many of us when we were building the early phase of the government. like many of you can remember, within the very first cabinet meeting I think we had, President Kibaki introduced to cabinet a proposal that we donate Cabernet Gardens to Daniel Arap Moi. At that time, some ministers were telling Kano people, you sit back, you didn't know how to rule, we show you how to rule, you are thieves. But here's a president who has been humiliated by Moi for years, saying, let us get out of the way a sense that you can be vindictive. Let us be larger than the conduct and behavior of those from whom we are taking power. Can we have the strength to say, we retire you with respect and donate to you a public asset you did not steal for all the years you were president? I want to finish off with the bit about humility, because recently I listened to something and I said, can you imagine President Mwai Kibaki saying, don't you know I am the president? When you are not adequate in yourself that you are holding an office, you look for external assurances that you are actually the boss, that you're holding that office. But Kibaki was too big for that kind of pettiness. And every time I hear anybody say, don't you know I am what? I miss Mwai Kibaki. Now, when Kibaki appointed me minister, there are 2-3 areas that were immediately challenging and important to us. With the Right Honorable Stephen Kalonzo Musyoka, we were members of Council of East African Community, and were in the final phase of negotiating a customs union for East Africa, which we did around Christmas 2005. The challenges we had were the contrasting national interests of Tanzania and Kenya, and Tanzania and Uganda, and Kenya and Uganda. For example, Tanzanians consume much more wheat in chapati than anybody else in East Africa in per capita terms. And therefore, as a country without production of any significant quantities of wheat, Tanzania will always want the cheapest, the lowest duty on wheat because of the chapati interest. Now, Kenya has some wheat farmers, like Laikipia and a few other places, not sufficient for our national interest, but requiring some protection from cheap wheat brought in under a low tariff on wheat products. And there we were, stuck in discussions with Tanzania. And we'll come back to Mwai Kibaki and he says, lazima tuonyeshe interest kwamba tunataka huu umoja wetu, it is important to us, but don't sacrifice Kenyan farmers for that umoja. Similarly, we had a challenge with Uganda. The state in Uganda was dominated by mercantilist capitalists, importers of low-cost merchandise from Eastern Asia, and trying to quickly turn a profit. But Kenya had a manufacturing base for some of the things Ugandan merchants were importing. So while Kenya wanted to protect capital goods and protect finished products which can be made in Kenya from being liberalized, Uganda wanted as low a tariff as possible on imports of goods which would be sold around. But as we walked this tight road of keeping friends, but also defining what is in the national interest, Kibaki was giving us 2 directions. We must belong together and only make concessions if we can now create domestic policy to become competitive and defeat the threat that comes with those concessions. If we're liberalizing wheat, what shall we do not to kill the wheat production in Kenya? If we want to be friends with Uganda, how can we not sacrifice the people who are making some significant products that are otherwise being imported cheaply by the traders who want lower tariffs on those finished goods? I say this because aligning actual national production interest with treaty building was a feature of leadership that has disappeared in our politics. Today is like we put saliva on a finger and we check where the direction of the wind is. Today I want that to be my friend, whether it is Kosovo or it is the rapid deployment forces. You say, how does this align with the national interest? There was no such conversation. But there's also something that I want to say that has not been properly mentioned. Mwai Kibaki believed in cabinet government. The president had ideas of what he wanted done, but he was ready to modify or even suspend those ideas on the basis of discussion within cabinet. I was impressed at how in some of the areas he knew better than most of us. But he had the humility as a leader to give every person a chance. And then when we're coming towards the end, he says, is there anybody who's opposing that position? For those of us who have not been in another cabinet, we're outraged when we hear about persons who use cabinet as a rubber stamp of personal decisions, because it never worked under Kibaki. And that way it gave us a strength to prosecute what the president was declaring in public, because we owned it as part of collective government. I had the privilege to be part of a delegation of Mwai Kibaki on a state visit to Thailand. And at the state dinner, I asked the Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been one of the most successful leaders in the Eastern Asian financial crisis at the turn of the century, what he had done for Thailand to recover from the financial crisis so rapidly compared to others. And when Shinawatra said, what we did is to believe that if a tree is wilting, you don't pour water to the leaves, you pour at the stem, that you start building from the bottom, the most effective bottom-up thinking. And it struck me so much, as so similar to what Mwai Kibaki had done in Kenya. In the first few months of becoming president, he brought through cabinet an urgent resolution that we buy back KCC, the Kenya Creameries, which had been taken off by Mwai and his son and a few others. And we got it back, and it immediately had an impact on the resuscitation of the dairy industry in this country. So walking the talk, believing that you align your international engagements with domestic responsibilities, and when you identify inadequacies, you deal with them. And importantly, reducing government borrowing in the domestic money markets to make credit affordable by entrepreneurs were key drivers to turning around a country which had problems similar to what we have today, but leadership very different. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kitui. Always grateful to hear from you. Honorable Gatonio Mochomba, MP for Githunguri, welcome. I would like to find out whether we could get that video clip from Professor Peter Anyang' Nyong'o. The import here, ladies and gentlemen, is to show you how a country in macroeconomic distress, in serious distress, makes a quick recovery with an impact on its ordinary citizens. And the people at the center of it was a gentleman we have here, the present governor of Kisumu, and a dear friend of mine, Professor Peter Anyang' Nyong'o. He did this video clip just for this purpose for us, because he was unable to be with us. But he's so devoted to the work he did with President Kibaki, turning the economy around, that he felt it was necessary to send us this message. Professor Nyong'o.
The governor of Kisumu, and the governor of Kisumu, now my secretary. Good morning. Mike, thank you for asking me to give a brief on what we did with the economic recovery strategy for wealth and employment creation in 2000. You know, the National Rainbow Coalition government had just come into power after a long period of fight for reforms, both for democracy as well as economic and social development in our country. So we decided to have a series of discourses with people before we could put anything in paper regarding our development program. So we called several meetings. One of them, which was very important, was the one we call at Leisure Lodge at the coast, with that cross-section of people, private sector, unions, development partners, government officials, investors. It's a very robust meeting where they said, okay, look, here we are, they're all Kenyans, they're all interested in the future of this country. We are in government, we have a reform project, a reform program. There it is. We would like first to deal with poverty in this country, and secondly, to open
Well, I should add, okay, now the role that was played by the private sector, the International Investors Conference that we had in Kenya in building up confidence in the country, raising net inflows of direct foreign investment, using aid well. An awful lot of that had to do with the origin of what was said at the very beginning, raising revenue. President's very precise directions to raise domestic revenue. With revenue in, government not having to borrow from the private sector meant there was enough liquidity in the banks. And his own genius, he decreed the central bank lower the cash reserve ratio, the amount of cash for security in the banking system that the central bank, our banks were flush with cash. They didn't know what to do, so they came to you, the citizens, something Kenyans have not seen for a long time, and gave the citizens the privilege and the power to change their own destiny. Good policy, good thinking. Because this is our second lecture series, I'd like to recognize the role Ambassador Muthaura played. He was the speaker last year, but unfortunately he had a tragedy at home. He couldn't be with us. And I want to recognize Ambassador Muthaura for the critical role he played in those days in coordinating the experts, the academics, and us. Actually, without him, very little could have done, because he is capable of working on 10 fronts at the same time, calmly and excitedly. And that helped our country. People may not recognize this, but we owe him as a country a lot. Thank you, Ambassador Muthaura, for what he did. We will have questions and answers before we come to the final conclusion, from the audience. So please be precise. Just one question, if you like, please, directed to a particular speaker. We just got like 10 minutes or that, 15 minutes of that, and then we wind up so that we can prepare for the next session. Yeah. Professor Naitula, is he here? Is he here? We got a message, you wanted to ask a question, it's not here. Okay, fine.
We'll try to limit the question three for every panelist.
Yeah.
So, we can go?
Yeah. If you just raise a question, raise a hand if you, and a comment. And if you say the government did well in the Kibaki years, that would be good too. Yes, and please tell us who you are, your institutional affiliation.
Thank you very much. My name is Saroni Jesse. I'm a student leader and part of a member of a Democratic Party. And I think I joined the Democratic Party because as a very young individual, because of the excitement that I saw among my elders of the promises that Kibaki was going to deliver. And when I got of age, I chose Democratic Party to join. I chose to join Democratic Party because of the belief that Kibaki had on the potential of our country. My question will go to Professor Kibwana, and it will be about the political challenges that we are facing as a country. If it were Kibaki, if Kibaki was the head of the country, what are some of the things that he would have done to be able to make every individual in Kenya to feel involved and to feel that to feel respected and to be able to calm the situation? Thank you very much.
Okay, you can have 2 or 3, and then I'll give the panel. So please note, Professor Kibwana. Yes, up here. You need a mic? Yeah, here. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Honorable Mercy Gapia, 12th Parliament, Kasarani constituency. My question is to Professor Kisa
Kitui.
Doctor. What would it take Mwai Kibaki, if he was there, on how was he doing it to sack or to fire a cabinet minister? What was the process or the procedure?
Okay, thank you, Mheshimiwa. Yeah, one more question on this side. Yeah. Yeah, the gentleman. Yeah.
My name is James Murigo. I'd like to talk to Kibaki. At the time we were working on the constitution, it was said that Honorable Mwai Kibaki was for having us 14 counties. We ended up with 47. Now, these 47, we argued at that time that they are going to be an economic burden to this country. Where did we go wrong?
Thank you, Mr. Murigo. Just one more question at the back, and then I'll give the...
My name is Kelvin Kishayan. I'm a student leader at the University of Nairobi. I've not yet joined any political party, but I can see the right personnel here to propel me somewhere. My question is to Professor Kibaki. What do you think the systems then, when President Kibaki was in office, what do you think were the systems that he put in place that we cannot have in the current government system? Because in Kenyan as a history, you could hear a lot about what Kibaki did. Most of the things that are there, it's because of Kibaki. What do you think? And what leadership qualities set President Kibaki apart? And how can current leaders emulate those traits? And one last one to Professor Kitui. How did President Kibaki's economic strategies, such as Vision 2030 and free primary education, shape Kenya's long-term development trajectory? Thank you.
Okay. I'll give the panel a chance to respond. Dr. Musa Kitui, there are two questions addressed to you.
Yes,
Please.
thank you. There were times when President Mwai Kibaki eased ministers out of office. The largest is after the vote on oranges and bananas. He basically disbanded cabinet and reconstituted it. But the other is when a minister was mentioned in a suspected scandal, he asked him to step aside pending investigation. And that he did went to his closest friends, like the late Minister for Finance, David Maraga. But he never ever asked Kibaki, will go after he has fired you to start saying you are stupid, you are incompetent, you are what in public. Secondly, if I may just take a take at counties, I was one of those people who ardently believed that at this stage of development, Kenya could not afford a new constitutional order which created 47 counties. You will suck all development resources into recurrent expenditure because of a bloated public bureaucracy. Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult democratically to get Kenya legislate to reduce the number of counties today. But this is a burden we have, which sometimes makes some people say, we wish there was a constitutional method of reorganizing things again. About what was shaped by Vision 2030, one of the most important contributions of Mwai Kibaki to Kenya's politics is the creation of free primary education, which has given us a generation of educated Gen Z who are rising above our generational responsibility and doing a lot to
Thank you, Lisa. Prof.
I appreciate the fact that two of the questions are from young people who are getting interested in the leadership of our country. And the first question was, given the current political problems that exist, suppose President Kibaki was the one to deal with them, how would that happen? The first way it would happen is most probably the problems would not be there. If they were, it would be, a small level of the problems. Because as I tried to say earlier, he was interested in actually getting this country to a good place. That was his, priority from when he began his political academic career and political career. But something that is very critical, which is not normally mentioned a lot, is in terms of youth affairs, like I was, through Osama Fazil, my docket of advising was extended to youth affairs. And he created the first youth ministry, and a very, very able permanent secretary for that ministry. And, the genesis of those youth funds, even the possibility of youth organization. So those were things that subsequently were not emphasized. And as a result, if we were even to go back to the legislation, the programs that President Kibaki initiated regarding the youth,
Nataka kutoka. Acha nitakuja, unaweza tengeneza, nitakuja kula.
And I think even from the experience of, particularly towards 2010, making the constitution, he more or less sent everybody who was in government to go and talk to the people about the benefits of this constitution so that there's no confusion. And that was some of the most critical, in my view, public participation that was done to midwife the constitution. And therefore, that idea of you need a conversation with your people so that they can ease whatever decisions must be taken. I think that was also foundational. So I think there are many lessons to be learned there. And the question about his leadership qualities, what would happen today if, again, similar, he was to, we were to use his thinking, to use his method to get us out of problems. We described, like in the initial stage, I described some of what we thought, and even Mukisa, Professor Gachagua, Professor Chege, what he put on the table, what he offered, what he wanted to mentor people to emulate, people to have space to learn how to be leaders, so that you didn't feel frightened that you could do wrong. Even if you say things that were not correct, there would be, he would talk to you privately, and that became a good thing. I think one of the as I conclude, one of the issues that is a problem in our country is this idea of not building on what has been laid before. Because when you prioritize building on a foundation, like when we got the Constitution, when we got what President Kibaki did, the more you build on that through President Uhuru Kenyatta currently, then you are successful. But if a time comes and maybe in recent times you decide that you want to start more or less afresh, it's not clear how that afresh is, then the country does not benefit from firm course, Mwai, and in that kind of, not ranking, in that kind of thinking, I cannot include the current president because he's still serving.
Thank you. Yeah. Briefly, Prof.
No, I'll be brief, and I'll go to the issue of the counties.